All right, welcome to the lecture on Sam Adams and the Birth of a Nation. We're discussing here the role of propaganda in contributing to the development of colonial unification. You also want to discuss Sam Adams' contributions to colonial unification and his manipulation of society's mood through the various learning objectives. So learning objective 1 is define propaganda and discuss its general role in pre-Revolutionary War America. So the first thing we need to understand is what is propaganda. Propaganda, the definition of it, is it's a systematic spreading of a given doctrine or allegations which reflect the views and interests of the propagandist or author. Propaganda is a political tool which is used to motivate a given group of people or individuals into a particular action or non-action. So vote for this candidate, don't vote for this candidate, be for this war, not be for this war, be for healthcare, don't be for this healthcare, whatever the case may be. As a political tool, it has no intrinsic goodness or badness. It's purely subjective. So you often see this with people's choices in news networks on television. So one person might find Fox News to be the most horrific news agency ever, where another person feels well informed by watching Fox News. It's purely subjective and has to do with a lot of the person's background. Propaganda is the manipulation of reality. It's the seduction of human emotions to create a desired image. It's important to understand that the use of propaganda as a political tool and how it was used by both popular leaders and the media during the colonial period and today. In today's society, there's a tendency to create the representation of democracy instead of representative democracy. So this iconic picture here of Barack Obama in the campaign of 2008 is a perfect example of the representation of democracy. Here you have this eminent leader looking off to the distance and seeing this hopeful future ahead of us. This picture spoke volumes to the image that Barack Obama's campaign was wanting to speak to people, and it was very appealing to people in 2008 on the heels of George W. Bush's tenure in office. And then you had this kind of counter image going around as well, this indecisive look on Barack Obama's face, playing on his adage of hope with nope or nope, this kind of a thing. So and it says very little, but you get the gist, right? Are you really sure this is the guy you want? It's calling into question his whole shtick. So during the colonial period, as well as today, the media participates in image making by the way it selects stories, and this is known as gatekeeping. So it first and foremost decides which stories to select, and then out of that selection, it decides how much time that story is going to get, where it's going to be placed. Is it going to be placed on the front page? Is it going to be placed at the beginning of the show? This kind of a thing. And this is a reflection of the people who own the networks. This is a reflection of the reporters. And there's a tendency sometimes to assume that news is supposed to give us objective information that we can basically discern from. And that's a noble expectation, but the people that are running these news agencies happen to be human beings, and they come with their own baggage, they come with their backgrounds, and they come with their agendas, and they come with their axes to grind. And so it's very hard to skirt the issue of propaganda in any given news agency. Some are conservative, some are liberal, some are what we would call mainstream, which is an agenda in itself. It's wanting to maintain the status quo. Now, whether that is something that we need to maintain or not, that's up to debate. But it's just good to know about this when you're watching any news. Now, that doesn't mean you should not watch news and be absolutely cynical about news. It's just that's just part of the package when you're discerning the information that comes out of it. So newspapers were the absolute sole news agency of this time. Like today we have television and the internet. Obviously they didn't have that back then. It was newspapers. And this was a very literate society relative to Europe, and there were newspapers in almost every single colony, at least one, if not two, in most major cities. And many of them were new, and many of them came into being after 1764, once this new British policy really imposed itself. So American unity from the Stamp Act on was promoted by newspaper accounts of what other colonies were doing, and this is how they began to communicate with each other and to prod each other on. Thus, Massachusetts was prodded into action by the newspaper reports of the Virginia Stamp Act resolves, and the need for a Continental Congress was fully debated in the press long before it actually convened. Although the newspapers were the most important means of communication, they more or less were tools of propagandists like Sam Adams and James Otis in Boston, Charles Thomson and Thomas Paine in Philadelphia, Richard Henry Lee and Patrick Henry of Virginia, just to name a few. These men are sometimes known as popular leaders and were primarily responsible for molding a common colonial identity by 1776. Because of the great diversity of the 13 American colonies, their emergence provided an indispensable common denominator for independence. They came to power during the 10-year period following the passage of the Stamp Act, because the traditional leadership class within the colonies found themselves unable to act in any effective way to deal with the new British policy. So it was through their own news agencies that many of these men were propagating that they came to be popular leaders and came to have power within colonial America and then the burgeoning United States of America. All right, that concludes Learning Objective 1. I'll see you in Learning Objective 2. Stay tuned.